Welcome to the new video of Neurophilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The unseen father within. Celibate. You ever noticed how certain emotions refuse to leave you, no matter how much you rationalize them away? That subtle guilt that lingers without reason, the quiet fear of not being enough, or the strange discomfort that arises in the presence of authority, as though you are a child again, waiting to be reprimanded. Most people assume these feelings come from their adult lives, from jobs, relationships, or disappointments. But that explanation barely scratches the surface. What holds you captive today was not created in the present. It was planted long ago, in the fragile years when you were still learning who you were allowed to be. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, devoted his life to uncovering the invisible forces that shape human behavior. He believed that beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts lies a vast, hidden landscape, the unconscious, where memories, emotions, and unresolved conflicts continue to influence us. Among his most striking revelations was this: the relationship you had, or did not have, with your father is one of the most powerful determinants of your inner life. This is not merely about whether your father was good or bad. It is about the psychic imprint left by his presence or absence. A father's approval, rejection, silence, or domination doesn't vanish when childhood ends. It becomes internalized, taking root as a voice within. That voice continues to whisper long after the man himself is gone. It is the voice that says, "Don't disappoint," or "You'll never be good enough." It is the voice that makes you overwork to earn validation, or that keeps you from speaking up for fear of punishment. Look closely and you'll see its fingerprints everywhere. You might find yourself constantly seeking others' approval, bending your needs to please people who do not deserve your loyalty. You might feel like an imposter, unable to recognize your worth even after success. Or perhaps you sabotage yourself before even trying, ruled by an invisible commandment that says failure would confirm your unworthiness. These patterns are not random. They are echoes of your early attempts to survive emotionally in the presence of a figure far larger than you could comprehend. The truth is that the human psyche does not forget, it only represses. Freud described how emotional energy that cannot be expressed does not disappear. It becomes trapped, transformed into symptoms, behaviors, or beliefs. If your father was absent, you might spend your life trying to fill that void with people, work, or achievements. If he was authoritarian, you may carry an inner critic that never lets you rest. If he was weak or submissive, you might oscillate between craving protection and resenting anyone who tries to guide you. There is no neutrality here. Every variation leaves a mark. Even those who claim to have moved on are often still haunted by this silent inheritance. The body tells the truth that the mind denies, in the tension of your shoulders when someone raises their voice, in the way you shrink before confrontation, in the restlessness that follows praise because, deep down, you don't believe you deserve it. These responses are not conscious choices. They are old survival mechanisms, learned in childhood and repeated unconsciously through adulthood. Freud saw the father as more than a personal figure. He saw him as an archetype, a symbol embedded in the collective psyche of humanity. The father represents law, order, and prohibition, the force that defines boundaries between desire and duty. Society itself, Freud argued, is built upon this archetype. Every institution, from religion to government, mirrors the same dynamic of authority and submission that begins at home. The personal father becomes the template for how we perceive all authority: teachers, bosses, leaders, even God. To understand yourself, then, is to confront this archetype within you, not to blame your father, but to recognize how deeply his shadow may still govern your life. Until you identify that influence, you remain bound to it. You will continue to live according to unconscious loyalties, repeating old emotional patterns, defending inherited beliefs, and confusing fear with respect. But awareness changes everything. The moment you begin to see how your behavior echoes an old dynamic, how your adult self is still negotiating with a ghost, you create space for freedom. Healing, Freud insisted, begins not with forgetting, but with remembering. When you bring the buried relationship with your father into consciousness, when you allow yourself to see it without denial or justification, you begin to loosen the chains that tie your present to your past. The father, whether loving, absent, harsh, or weak, is not simply a person in your memory. He is a structure within your psyche, one that shapes your relationship with power, success, and self-worth. To awaken to that truth is not an act of accusation, but of liberation. Only by facing the unseen father within can you begin to live a life that truly belongs to you, one that is guided not by the inherited voices of the past, but by the clarity of your own. The origin of inner conflict, the Oedipus and Electra complex. Both the roots of your deepest emotional struggles do not lie in adulthood, not in a toxic relationship, an unfulfilling career, or a recent betrayal. They reach much further back, to a time before you even understood language. Psychoanalysis teaches that the mind's greatest battles begin not when we are grown, but when we are just learning what love means. And at the center of that battlefield lies one of the most powerful and misunderstood discoveries in psychology, the Oedipus complex. Between the ages of 3 and 6, every child begins to form intense emotional bonds with their parents. To the outside world, it seems innocent: affection, curiosity, imitation. But within the unconscious, a quiet drama begins. The child experiences a deep attachment to one parent, desiring their exclusive love and attention, and perceives the other as a rival for that affection. Freud called this universal phenomenon the Oedipus complex, after the ancient Greek myth of Oedipus, the man fated to kill his father and marry his mother. It is not about literal desire or violence, but about the psychological tensions that define how we learn love, authority, and guilt. For a young boy, the mother becomes the first object of affection, the one who provides warmth, safety, and care. But soon he discovers she is not his alone. The father stands between them, a figure of power, competition, and prohibition. The boy loves his father, yet also feels jealousy and fear toward him. He wants his mother's affection, but fears punishment for desiring what is forbidden. This conflict gives birth to the earliest feelings of guilt and anxiety, emotions far too complex for a child to understand. Unable to resolve the contradiction, the psyche represses it, burying it deep within the unconscious. For girls, Freud saw a mirrored pattern that his student Carl Jung later developed into what he called the Electra complex. Here, the father becomes the idealized object of affection, while the mother is unconsciously seen as a rival. Like the Oedipal boy, the girl experiences desire, jealousy, and guilt, emotions that shape her understanding of love and identity for years to come. Whether one agrees with every detail of Freud's theory is less important than understanding its metaphorical truth. Every human being must come to terms with desire, authority, and the limits imposed by love. These early experiences do not vanish. They evolve into the internal structures of the adult mind. The forbidden longing becomes shame, the rivalry becomes fear of rejection, and the parental authority becomes the superego, the inner judge that watches and reprimands every impulse. Freud described the superego as the moral overseer within us, born from the internalized authority of the father. It carries his voice, his tone, and his rules. Even when he is long gone, that voice remains, criticizing, measuring, commanding. This is why so many adults live under invisible pressure. The person who strives for perfection at any cost is still trying to earn approval from the internal father. The one who feels small before authority is reliving the childhood fear of disapproval. The individual who avoids intimacy because it feels dangerous is obeying a buried belief that love leads to guilt and punishment. The patterns seem personal, but they are echoes of the earliest emotional blueprint your psyche ever built. What makes this conflict so difficult to escape is that you don't remember it. Conscious memory cannot reach those years. Yet the emotions remain alive, shaping your choices, reactions, and relationships. You may believe these behaviors are simply your personality, when in truth they are survival mechanisms learned during a time when love and fear were inseparable. You were not choosing, you were adapting. If the Oedipus and Electra complexes remain unresolved, they continue to replay in adult life like a forgotten melody. You may find yourself drawn to unavailable partners, constantly competing with authority figures or sabotaging success out of guilt for surpassing those you once feared. These are not random patterns. They are the psyche's way of repeating an ancient scene, hoping this time the ending will change. Freud's insight was that repression does not erase conflict, it only transforms it. What is unhealed becomes destiny. But he also offered hope. By bringing the unconscious into awareness, we can interrupt the repetition. When you begin to see how your choices echo your earliest relationships, when you recognize that the voice of authority you fear is an echo of childhood, not reality, the spell begins to weaken. The Oedipal drama is not a story about sin. It is the story of how love, desire, fear, and guilt first entered your soul. It is the emotional foundation upon which all later experiences of intimacy and power are built. To heal it is to reclaim the ability to love freely, without fear, without rivalry, without guilt. It is to transform love from a battlefield into a meeting of equals. The birth of the inner judge, the paternal complex. When the emotional storm of childhood becomes too much to bear, the mind performs one of its most extraordinary acts of survival. It internalizes the conflict. The external father, once a figure of awe, fear, or longing, becomes a voice inside the psyche. This transformation gives birth to what Freud called the paternal complex, the silent judge who takes residence in the unconscious and never entirely leaves. You might think you outgrew your father long ago. Perhaps you moved out, built your own life, made your own choices. But deep down, the relationship never truly ended. It changed form. When a child cannot openly express love, anger, or fear toward their father, the psyche turns inward. It preserves those feelings as a symbolic image, an inner father who continues to govern thought, emotion, and behavior. This is not fantasy. It is the architecture of the unconscious. In The Ego and the Id, Freud described how the mind, unable to cope with the tension of forbidden emotions, resolves it by internalizing authority. The father's rules, judgments, and expectations are absorbed into the developing ego, forming the superego, that part of you that monitors, criticizes, and punishes. The child no longer needs the real father to scold them. The voice has been installed internally. From then on, the child carries the judge within. This mechanism is universal. When the father was absent, the child filled the void by inventing an idealized image, a perfect, unreachable father figure whose approval must somehow be earned. When the father was harsh or violent, the child developed a cruel inner critic that anticipates punishment before it even happens. And when the father was weak or submissive, the child internalized the message that the world has no protection, leading to anxiety, mistrust, and a need to control everything. What matters is not what your father actually was, but what your mind made of him. Because the psyche cannot tolerate emptiness, it creates an image to complete the story. That imagined father, whether tyrant, savior, or ghost, becomes a lifelong presence. Every authority figure you meet, every relationship you build, every standard you hold yourself to, is filtered through this internalized image. You may not realize it, but you have been speaking to him and arguing with him all your life. Think of the moments when you felt an urge to please your boss or mentor, even when it meant betraying your own needs. Think of the times you froze under criticism or felt unworthy despite success, or the times you rebelled against authority simply because it felt unbearable to obey. These are not isolated reactions. They are echoes of the ancient struggle between the child and the father. Some people submit, others defy, but both are still caught in the same emotional orbit. This is the tragedy of the paternal complex. You are not merely haunted by your father, you have become him. The voice that shames you for failure, that whispers, "You should have done better," or "You don't deserve this," is the father's voice living inside the psyche. Freud saw this as one of humanity's most powerful and paradoxical creations, the internalized authority that both sustains morality and generates endless guilt. Civilization itself, he argued, depends on this structure, but individuals suffer under its weight. The result is compulsive repetition, a cruel psychological cycle in which we unconsciously recreate the same emotional patterns from childhood. You might continually attract critical partners, domineering bosses, or emotionally distant friends. Or you might find yourself playing the role of the father, controlling, judging, or rescuing others to avoid your own inner conflict. No matter how far you run, the same story finds you again, disguised as new people and situations. Why does this happen? Because the unconscious does not seek peace, it seeks resolution. It keeps repeating what was left unfinished, hoping this time the outcome will change. But until the conflict is brought to awareness, it never does. The father you are fighting is not out there, he is in here, embedded in the very structure of your mind. To break the pattern, you must first see it. You must recognize when the voice of the inner judge is speaking and understand that it is not your true self. The paternal complex loses its grip the moment you realize that you are no longer the child who needed permission to exist. The goal is not to destroy the father within, but to transform him. The same voice that once condemned you can, when understood, become a voice of discernment, a guide rather than a tyrant. But this transformation begins only when you stop obeying the ghost of authority and start listening to your own. That is the beginning of inner freedom. The moment you realize that the voice that once ruled you is yours to rewrite. The father and civilization. Obedience as heritage. To understand the full power of the father figure, we must look beyond the walls of the home. Freud saw something few dared to imagine, that the same psychic structure shaping a child's relationship with their father also shapes entire civilizations. What begins as a personal drama becomes a blueprint for social order. Humanity, Freud argued in Totem and Taboo and later in Civilization and its Discontents, was built on the myth of the primordial father, the first great authority whose presence defined the boundaries between freedom and punishment, desire and law, chaos and structure. In the earliest human tribes, the father was not simply a man, he was a symbol of absolute power. He owned the women, controlled the food, and commanded obedience. He embodied both protection and terror. And when the sons, suffocated by his rule, finally rose against him, as myth and legend suggest, they did not become free, they became guilty. The act of rebellion created a wound so deep that the psyche of humanity has carried it ever since. In their guilt, they built the first moral systems. They sanctified the memory of the slain father, worshipping him as a god and creating laws to ensure that no one would ever challenge his image again. Thus was born religion, authority, and civilization itself, founded not on freedom, but on guilt and obedience. Freud's insight was staggering. The archetype of the father became the invisible backbone of society, the divine lawgiver, the patriarch, the judge, the general, the ruler, each a reflection of the same primordial figure. In religion, we call him God the Father, all-seeing and omnipotent. In politics, he becomes the supreme leader or president who demands loyalty and sacrifice. In the corporate world, he manifests as the CEO whose approval defines worth. Even in families, the same structure repeats. The father's word as final, his authority unquestioned. This pattern is not confined to power, it extends into the soul. You may think you live freely, but centuries of conditioning have trained your unconscious to associate obedience with virtue and disobedience with guilt. Society does not need to force submission. It teaches you to police yourself. You feel anxiety at the thought of disappointing a superior. You shrink before charismatic figures. You hesitate to challenge what feels above you. That hesitation is not merely social fear, it is ancestral fear. The same fear the sons felt when they looked at the face of the primordial father and dared to rebel. From childhood, we are educated to internalize this system. The schoolroom becomes the first stage of social obedience. The teacher, like a miniature patriarch, rewards compliance and punishes disobedience. Later, religion deepens the pattern with the idea of an all-seeing father who watches your every thought. Then comes the workplace, the legal system, the government, each reinforcing the same hierarchy, the same emotional dynamic. Someone above you holds judgment, and you must earn approval to feel safe. What began as a necessary structure for survival has become a psychological cage. The same voice that once ensured civilization's stability now stifles individuality. We confuse obedience with morality and conformity with safety. And yet, paradoxically, The very laws that protect us also imprison us, not in physical cells, but in the mind. To question authority, therefore, is not merely a political act, it is a psychological awakening. Every time you doubt the inner voice that says, "You can't," you are not just challenging a belief, you are confronting millennia of conditioning. You are facing the collective father that humanity built to contain its fear of chaos. But liberation cannot come through mere rebellion. Rage without understanding simply creates a new form of tyranny. True freedom, Freud implied, is achieved through awareness, by recognizing the inner machinery that compels obedience. When you understand that your guilt, your fear of disapproval, your impulse to submit are not uniquely yours, but inherited responses passed down through generations, you begin to see clearly. The cultural superego, that invisible network of laws, morals, and hierarchies, loses its power when it is brought into consciousness. The question is no longer, who must I obey, but what part of me is still obeying? Once you see that your submission is psychological, not natural, you can begin to reclaim the authority you once surrendered. To do so is not to reject the idea of the father, but to transform it. The archetype need not vanish. It must evolve. The true father, in its mature form, is not a figure of control, but of wisdom. He does not demand obedience, but guides through example. When you integrate this version within yourself, you no longer need to bow to external authority. You become your own measure of right and wrong. In this sense, liberation is not rebellion against the father, it is reconciliation with him. Civilization may have been built on obedience, but consciousness allows us to build something higher, a world where responsibility replaces fear and understanding replaces submission. That is the next step in human evolution, to become both the child who understands and the father who forgives. The work of freedom. Awareness is where freedom begins, but it is only the doorway, not the destination. Once you understand how the inner father shapes your fears, choices, and beliefs, a deeper challenge appears: how to live differently, how to stop obeying the ghosts that no longer deserve your obedience, how to build a life not ruled by guilt, approval, or fear of punishment. Freud called this process working through, the conscious unraveling of unconscious chains. It is the hardest form of work, not because it is intellectually complex, but because it demands honesty. The first step is recognition. You must learn to catch the voice of the internal father in real time, the one that tells you to stay small, to apologize for existing, to earn love instead of accepting it. Notice when it speaks, when you hesitate to express your opinion because you fear being judged, when you feel guilty for setting boundaries, when you work until exhaustion trying to impress someone who isn't even watching. Each moment is an echo of childhood obedience. Awareness begins when you stop mistaking that echo for truth. But awareness alone is fragile. The mind resists change. For years you may have believed that the inner critic was your conscience, that it kept you disciplined, moral, and safe. Letting go of it feels like betrayal. This is why self-observation must be patient and compassionate. You are not fighting a monster. You are learning to separate your authentic voice from the one you inherited. Write down what triggers your guilt, shame, or fear. Ask yourself, whose approval am I trying to earn? Whose disappointment am I trying to avoid? These questions begin to reveal the invisible dialogue between you and the father within. At some point, self-reflection reaches its limits. The unconscious hides its roots too deeply for reason alone to uncover. This is where therapy becomes essential, not the surface-level talk of daily frustrations, but the slow excavation that Freud and his successors described. A skilled psychoanalytic or depth-oriented therapist helps you revisit those buried conflicts with safety and understanding. In the therapeutic room, repetition turns into revelation. You start to see how you project the father onto every figure of authority, how guilt drives your relationships, how obedience disguises itself as love. Gradually, the voice that once condemned you begins to soften. You realize that the internal father, the superego, is not your enemy. It was born from your need for protection, your fear of loss, your longing for belonging. It was a survival structure. But what once protected you now restricts you. The task is not to silence that voice, but to transform it into something wiser, an inner guide that evaluates without cruelty and corrects without humiliation. That is the mature father within, the one who leads by wisdom rather than control. Outside the therapeutic space, practice must continue. Reflective writing can externalize emotions that words cannot express in conversation. Mindful meditation helps you observe thoughts and judgments without identifying with them. Physical movement, walking, stretching, breathing, reconnects you with the body that has long carried emotional memory. Every conscious act becomes a small rebellion against the tyranny of the unconscious. And still, freedom demands courage. Because once you begin to dismantle inherited authority, the world may resist. People accustomed to your compliance may accuse you of arrogance. Systems built on obedience will not celebrate your awakening. You may feel loneliness where certainty once lived. But that emptiness is not loss. It is the space where authenticity grows. It is the silence that follows when the old judge finally stops shouting. Freedom, Freud suggested, is not the absence of constraint, it is the presence of choice. It means acting from awareness rather than compulsion. It means recognizing when you are reenacting a script and choosing a different line. You cannot erase the past, but you can rewrite its meaning. Each act of consciousness weakens the power of the inherited father. Each moment of truth is a small revolution. And so, the work of freedom is endless, not because we are doomed, but because growth never stops. The goal is not perfection, but integration. To make peace with the inner father, to forgive the real one, and to live with the authority that comes from within. When you can say no without guilt, and yes without fear, when your actions are guided by understanding instead of obedience, you have entered adulthood in the truest sense. You are no longer the child seeking approval, nor the rebel seeking vengeance. You are the reconciled self, the one who sees clearly, acts freely, and carries the wisdom of both love and power. This is the final liberation Freud hinted at but rarely named. The quiet strength of those who have faced their shadows and no longer bow to them. That is the work of freedom. The lifelong art of becoming your own father, your own authority, your own truth.